Good morning and welcome to today's video. I'm going to speed things up in the vlog today a little quicker than normal and go immediately to the shop to jump into today's subject. Now there's no denying that cyclocross bikes and gravel bikes can be remarkably similar. In fact, the two types of riding share so much in common that you could pretty well be excused for thinking that the bikes are exactly the same. In fact, in previous videos that I've talked about this subject, a few of you guys have gone and found examples of companies taking their cyclocross bike and that bike's geometry and literally marketing it under a different name and calling it a gravel bike. Although in my opinion, any company that's trying to market one bike as two separate ones under two different names is just being completely lazy and is really not worth your time whatsoever. So for this video, I've got a gravel bike from Rally, the Willard 2, and a similar leveled cross bike from Felt, the F55X. And I'm plugging the two geometries into an Excel file built by someone with far too much time on their hands. I'll link that Excel file down below. Now I understand why you would wonder why maybe I chose a Rally and a Felt to compare and why it wouldn't be better to compare two bikes from the same brand. To be totally honest with you, I don't have a Rally cross bike here. I did plug the geometries from a Rally cross bike in against the Willard 2 and netted basically the same results. Now, with the comparing of these two different bikes, I think it's worth comparing the two different types of riding. And to do that, we kind of need to evaluate the different demands of the different types of riding. So first, for cyclocross, if you're not familiar, it's like road bike crit racing mixed with cross-country mountain bike racing, timed at about 45 minutes to an hour plus a lap, depending on where you're at. And it'll take place on a number of different terrains, including off-road grassy sections. So you end up with a lot of off-cambers, a lot of weird climbs, a lot of switchback turns, all in a lot of different succession. There's a lot of demands that come into play for a cross bike. It needs to be able to do a lot of different things. It has to be able to handle some fast road sections in fast cyclocross courses, and it has to be able to handle some muddy and terrifying descents. So that's two very different things that bike needs to be able to handle, possibly in one race. So overall, a cross bike sometimes makes compromises to be able to handle all of these things. It literally is, in every bit of the definition, the do-everything bike, because cyclocross racing encompasses so many different types of riding. With a cross bike, you are simply just trying to mix agility with stability the best that you possibly can, so that you can effectively use it over a multitude of different cross courses in the fastest way that you can as a rider. And unfortunately for us, every company has different ideas on what that geometry for cyclocross bikes is. So don't necessarily think that the bike that I'm using for an example is the be-all, end-all. You kind of unfortunately need to ride a bunch of different ones to get an idea of what you love. And then there's the demands of gravel riding. This is a gravel bike here. Generally with gravel riding, it's glorified road bikes off-road. Long straight sections on really rough roads. A lot of times you'll find yourself on like a fire road, lots of climbing, lots of descents, not a whole lot in the way of slow speed switchback turns, nothing really in the way of really bad off-camber riding. In reality, it's a lot like road riding, just on far rougher roads for really long distances. And it really comes down to comfort is the name of the game, not so much agility. And one of those things that's going to make you more comfortable is a really stable bike that works with you while you're bouncing over really rocky and terrible roads, especially once you start getting up to speed going down some of the descents that you find on old beat up fire roads. The demands for a gravel bike are just overall simpler than that of a cyclocross bike. So in that regard, they can actually tip the geometry scales to a much more consistent side across the board. And you'll kind of see that with a lot of different brands. They are still sort of experimenting with their gravel bike geometries, but they all kind of are converging to the same sort of formula. You can kind of see the patterns coming out of every brand for what works geometry-wise for the demands of gravel bike riding. So you'd be forgiven for looking at these two bikes and saying that they do look incredibly similar, or that they are the same. Because in reality, they do look incredibly similar and they're very closely related. they share a pretty significant amount of design properties. But there are a few key things that do tend to pop up between the difference of a cyclocross bike and a gravel bike that do make up the difference. So with all that, what exactly are the differences? So I have this stuff plugged into the Excel file that someone that I can't remember their name made, and I came out with some differences that I basically expected, but it's nice to see them overlaid on top of each other. And the first thing that I like to kind of acknowledge is the fact that the head tube angle is different and that the cross bike is slightly steeper and does net a lower amount of trail than the gravel bike does. And I would sort of expect this because the demands of a cross course constitute that you need to be able to steer quickly around switchback turns and be able to throw the bike around. And that gets harder to do as a head tube angle gets more slack. And if you've ever ridden a bunch of different mountain bikes, you'll know this feeling of wheel flop that goes back and forth. It's not a great feeling at low speed, but when you're barreling down at high speed, it creates a really stable feeling front end. So that's why you'll see the gravel bike that rides on dirt roads in a straight line for a long time have a slightly more slack head tube angle and a higher amount of trail than you will a cross bike. The second important thing that I like to look at is the amount of bottom bracket drop that you'll have between the two bikes. And generally, a cross bike will have a less bottom bracket drop, or in other words, the bottom bracket height from the ground with an equivalent amount of tire will be higher on a cross bike. This is of course something you would also expect out of a cross bike, especially with the demands of most cyclocross courses. You might find yourself riding on an angle like this with the bike like this, and that's called an off camber. When you're riding along like this, you risk what's called pedal strike on the side that's higher than the side that's lower. So to combat this, a lot of companies will build their cross bikes with a higher bottom bracket to give it some clearance so that it doesn't strike as you're riding over an off camber. It's also pretty important when you're going around tight switchback turns and you actually want to pedal through them. If you were riding something with a relatively low bottom bracket, like a gravel bike or a touring bike, for example, you would find yourself striking the ground in hard leans in switchback turns. And it's not something that you can't deal with, but it is nice to know that you have the security of that extra lean as you're going around corners as quick as possible. Anything you can do in a cross race to lower the amount of things that you need to think about is definitely worthwhile. And a lower bottom bracket, like you would find on a gravel bike, would definitely make it more difficult to get around some of that really technical stuff. Now the beauty of a lower bottom bracket is it does make you feel more planted in the bike instead of perched on top of it. So that's why you're going to find a lower bottom bracket on a bike that doesn't need to be leaned so much, because it does offer a bit more stable of a ride. And if you're going to be flying down rough roads at high speeds, stability is definitely key, not agility trying to go around a corner as fast as possible. The third thing you'll see is that generally you'll see a shorter chainstay. This is one of those things that companies do, and that like a lot of people sort of assume that a shorter chainstay offers a snappier, more responsive bike. And that's one of those things that you're going to kind of look for when you're getting out of corners as quick as possible, going from low speed to high speed with as much effort as you can. You want the bike to be pretty stiff in that bottom bracket chainstay area, so a shorter chainstay will help with that. This in turn does affect wheelbase a little bit, but it depends on the design of the front triangle. Oddly enough, in this case, the cross bike actually has a longer wheelbase than the gravel bike does, but I sort of chalk that down to the fact that felt only does weird half sizes. They do 53, 55, where the rally here is a 54 and then a 56. So wheelbase wise, I'm a little bit surprised to see that the cross bike is slightly longer, only by 6 millimeters, but typically a cross bike will have a shorter wheelbase, and really the reason for that is sort of all in the same, where you're looking for something that splits the difference between stable on downhills but quick and agile around all the twisty turns that you get into in a cross course. A longer wheelbase is going to be far more stable, and that's why you're going to see a longer wheelbase typically on a gravel bike than over a cyclocross bike. So the last thing I'm going to hit on difference-wise is the top tube design. And it's not something that you necessarily would see in geometry charts unless you looked at standover heights, but I don't have that plugged into these. I just know from the pictures that come up through this Excel file that you're going to get a lower standover height on a gravel bike than you will a cross bike. And really the reasoning for that is the front triangle of a cross bike does need to be opened up a little bit more than any other bike. Because you do find yourself shouldering the bike when you get to run-ups or when you get to stairs, anything that's a forced dismount that has you carrying or portaging the bike for a long period of time. Now, a gravel bike doesn't necessarily need to worry about that because it's not something that is exactly expected in your gravel or adventure rides. And really you get more out of having more seat post out than you do having more frame to put your arm through on a gravel bike, comfort-wise. Now, beyond all that we just went through, cyclocross bikes and gravel bikes do share a lot in common. And that kind of really comes down to the most obvious and easy thing to see: tires. Now you can see that on this gravel bike, it's running 40C tires, where every cross bike is limited to 33mm tires, but the clearances are similar. They just happen to be for different things. A cross bike has a lot of clearance so that mud can make its way through and not impede the wheel from turning during a really thick, gross, muddy race, where a gravel bike's clearance design is mostly to fill it with as much tire as possible, therefore making this bike slightly more comfortable than that one. But the clearance thing, that's interchangeable. You can fit as much tire on there as you want when you're not racing in a UCI event, and you could put a 33mm tire on this and use all that extra space for mud clearance if you wanted to. Although I don't know why you would. Okay, so I kind of want to add in to the rest of this that in comparing the two geometries of these bikes, I really noticed that a lot of the differences are well within a pretty small margin. The head tube angle is different by 1 degree. The wheelbase is different by 6mm. The bottom bracket drop is different by 10. That's pretty significant. The trail of these bikes was different by about 4mm. And for the average rider, some of that stuff's not really going to be noticeable. But if you tried to put a gravel bike like this into the demands of a lot of different cross courses, you might find yourself relatively impeded by its geometry. And that if you went over to a cross-specific bike, you could end up being faster around a lot of things. But that's not to say that you couldn't get totally used to riding that bike and just become an absolute killer anywhere you go. Because no matter what a company tells you that a bike is supposed to feel like, it ultimately comes down to the bike that you like the feel of the most and the one that you like to ride. So take everything that kind of came out here today with a bit of a grain of salt when you're making your decision on what you want to get. So now that you're armed with the information of the differences, minute as it might be, between a gravel bike and a cyclocross bike, which one is going to be right for you? Well, for a simple question, I have a simple answer. If you want to get into riding road bikes off-road, but you're thinking about doing some cyclocross as well, get a cross bike. It's going to be able to handle any bit of gravel road riding that you throw at it. It will handle every descent that you want to do. On top of that, you find yourself with a bike that is designed with the demands of cyclocross racing in mind. Now, on the other hand, if you don't think that you're going to really dabble into cyclocross too much, but your overall goal is to ride road bikes as an adventure, off-road, a lot of time on fire roads, and a lot of time with gear strapped to the bike, then go ahead and get yourself a gravel bike. It already comes with big tires usually. They're sort of built to be adventure machines. Cyclocross bikes don't really have a whole lot in the way of eyelets for racks, fenders, that a gravel bike generally does have. And that, in my opinion, is as simple as it really needs to get. And if at the end of it all you found that you've made the wrong decision completely, it doesn't really matter because both can be relatively interchangeable. I would say that they're at least 80% as good as one another in their two different disciplines. That's how close they kind of are. So I hope that helped if you really weren't sure of the differences between these two bikes, or you were sort of confused because a lot of people like to shoot from the hip and say they're exactly the same. Now, if you don't normally follow my videos, I will say that I generally do it in a bit more of a vlog format. This one I wanted to shorten down a little bit because I knew it would be labor intensive for me, and it's full of a lot of information that can kind of be tough to get through if I vlog my life while I'm getting there. So be sure to go check out the other stuff. You're gonna notice that it's a little bit different than what this was. If that interests you, be sure to go check out the other stuff. So, bye.